National Gambling Board reported to Parliament that South Africa's gambling operators earned 75 billion rand in 2024-25, with 47 billion rand coming from online betting. Concerns are rising over the use of SASSA social grants for gambling and the surge of online gambling advertisements. Now, Acting CEO Lungile Dukwana joins us for this discussion. Lungile, thank you so much for the time. I'm actually going to start this by asking you our poll question. Because our poll question that we're asking the audience today is, do you think South Africa has a gambling problem? 92% of people that have voted so far in that are saying, yes, it's out of hand. What would the National Gambling Board say? Do you think that it's a problem?
Well, good morning, Arabil, and good morning to the Newzroom Afrika team and the listeners. Look, I think that when you look at the issue of gambling in South Africa, and I think that it may not just be a South African phenomenon, there is really a huge number of the people that are gambling. I think almost everybody may have someone that he knows that may be gambling. But in terms of what we looked at as the Gambling Board, one of the aspects we identified when we were doing our own surveys, we did what is called a problem gambling survey that we actually did. And part of it was telling us that of the people we actually surveyed, 31% of them can be categorized as problem gambling people. And I think that that's a challenge that we all face in that regard. But one of the challenges also is further that the people are using gambling as a source of income rather than being a recreational activity. And that's where the problem is.
Was it always meant to be seen as recreational activity? And I say that because when one wins, you use that extra funds, one would assume, to do other things. But it's moved so far. And when you say 31% of the people that you surveyed then are actually in a part of this problem gambling, I mean, even just 1% would be 1% too many, but 31% already tells that it's a problem, right?
It is a problem. We accept that it is actually a problem. But the intention was never to use it as a source of income. And I think that one of the things that promotes that being seen as a source of income is some of the advertising that may not be all in line, and that may be violating some of the regulations of the act that we actually have on our side. So it is a problem like that. And the use of the celebrities like yourselves in promoting some of these is actually one of the challenges that is there, because you're following, for example, maybe young people who would look at you and say, well, if the years made Arabile to be this rich, then it means that I can be rich as well. I think that's where the challenge is. And those are the things that we need to do. But also the kind of the advertising that takes place anytime when the young people are actually watching, and the other related people that are not supposed to be targets of that advertising, as we put it. So I think that those are the areas that we need to rein in to deal with some of those particular challenges that we're facing today.
Yeah, I can tell you for sure that if I wanted to be rich, journalism might not necessarily have been the road I really chose. But nonetheless, there's you spoke about some of the advertising not being in line with a lot of the regulations as well. What is wrong with the advertising right now as you see it? Because my question mark would be whether it should actually be happening at different times to avoid a younger audience, etc., or how exactly should the advertising be happening?
In fact, our proposal, Arabile, would have been that it must happen at certain times, because some of the times when the younger people or when the incorrect audience is watching, they're not supposed to be watching that one. So you would have to restrict it in terms of the time of doing it. Maybe some of the people would see it to be too radical. But secondly, it can't be that every time you open your radio, the first thing you hear is an advertising for gambling. I think that is basically a challenge. Of course, we don't underestimate the fact that gambling on its own also contributes huge in terms of our own economy as a country, because it's an economic activity. But we think that it should not be beyond above the social harm that we should be experiencing as a country. And I think that the task that we have as NGP, that we have as the provincial licensing authorities on the boards, part of the things that we should be looking at is to make sure that we do manage that so that there's no recklessness in those that are licensed and they don't advertise anywhere, anytime, and violate some of the conditions. And we think that that is where we'll be spending our time making sure that we align the advertising with the requirements. For now, I think that we are working also with the advertising authorities to make sure that there's an understanding of what may be reckless advertising that may be affecting the prevalence of gambling in South Africa.
Can any of this be reversed? Because some might say, well, the horse has bolted already and there's nothing much you can really do about it except give some sort of, let's say, tobacco-style advertising ban in the country, which would limit just how much they are able to advertise, where exactly they're seen, etc. But it still contributes significantly. It's still a massive economic generator when it comes to tobacco. And I mean, gambling and betting itself, creating nearly 14,000 jobs in our country.
Well, you see, it would be too radical to say that there should be no advertising at all. But I think that it needs to be aligned with our social dynamics that we actually have. Because even if we generate that much of income and that much of a jobs, it should not be to the extent that it will have a negative social harm to all of those. And we're managing some of these things because we're working with the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation, for example, which does a lot of work in terms of managing the social harm that may arise as a result that, and those ones who may be problem gamblers. I think they do come in nicely here. We do a lot of campaigns education-wise to target, for example, the younger people, but we also target the older people who may be gambling as well. And our concern is that some of the money that is concerned is the one that is basically social, the social net that we should be having in the country, some of the instances, but some of it may be the one that is provided for educative purposes and should be used for educative purposes and other ways that are actually happening. In fact, we realize that some of the people are taking the money, the expenditure they should be doing groceries with or paying school fees with and gamble with it. For us, that tells us that that is a problem and we need to be managing that. And I think that those who are licensed are contributing largely to dealing with the harm with this when they're working with the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation. But also at the same time, whilst they are doing that, we need to be making sure that we do our part. That's our campaign in terms of education. We are collaboratively working with most of the stakeholders to make sure that there's awareness around that issue and there's education around it.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about the use of SASSA social grants money in order to gamble has also risen up as a key component here that keeps on being spoken about. Should we be changing the regulations to fit into what is a post-COVID-19 world? Because people have moved away quite significantly from casinos and physical gambling slots to online betting. And how difficult has that made your job in trying to ensure that the regulations are adhered to? Because online betting can be in various ways and people could join almost any that might not even be regulated.
Well, I think that's an important point you are raising because we have seen a rise of the illegal online betting, which becomes very hard to police because by its nature, it's actually clandestine because it's not licensed. So we're doing a lot of work on that aspect to make sure that we block those ones that are coming into the space because obviously you cannot police them, but where you find them, you must be able to block them and make sure that they don't make that kind of an impact. We think that in relation to the amendment of the regulations, of course, there is a need for the amendment of the regulations to accommodate the post-COVID situation that we had. In fact, I know that the department, the ministry, and the portfolio committee and all of those are actually seized with this to make sure that we deal with the issue of amending the regulations to go according to some of the challenges that we are experiencing today compared to the pre-COVID period that we actually had. Because when you look at the pre-COVID period, the casinos were doing quite well, and the betting was not doing as much well at that particular point. But it increased quite a lot during the COVID period, and now there's no catching up. The other one is going down, the other one is going up. But we must also take care of the investment that is being made by the casinos, those physical ones that are making, and the jobs that they are creating need to be protected. And I think that our department is aware of that, our ministry is aware of that, and their portfolio committee is aware of that, and the necessary steps will be taken to deal with some of the issues.
Yeah, Lungile, what penalties currently exist, though, for any of the operators who fail to comply with things like advertising rules, particularly that are age-gating rules, especially? And are they being enforced effectively? Because to have those rules in place is one thing, but for them to be enforced effectively is another.
In fact, well, we think that there's a huge room for improvement in relation to dealing with the issue of advertising. Our proposal, I think, from the NGP perspective, is that we need to be coming up with the norms and standards that are going to ensure uniform application of those regulations in relation to advertising. And we are taking a paper to the next NGPC on this particular matter to make sure that it receives the necessary attention and it receives the necessary policy backing in terms of the implementation of that. And also we're working with the advertising standards authority to make sure that this aspect in the way that they manage advertising, it's actually taken into account so that the messages are not misleading messages that are going to take us to further challenges as we are facing at this particular point in time. Of course, yes, we will be improving on the aspect of the advertising and the enforcement of the rules around the advertisement, because that is a collaborative functions that we have with the provincial licensing authorities, the NGP, and the other related stakeholders, including the law enforcement agencies, in working with some of those particular things and to deal with that. Yeah. Now, if you look at the aspect of the illegal gambling, there's a provision in the Act, for example, for those ones who are, for example, operating illegal gambling at the internet cafes that you would find from time to time. And it gives maybe a minimum of about 10 million rands and in fine, but also 10 years in jail where you are found to have violated the regulation. So there is a provision for that. But we need to identify this as a serious crime and make sure that it's dealt with accordingly. And that will only happen in partnership with the law enforcement agencies moving forward.
Yeah, that partnership, very important. Other partnerships include those with social development or the Social Security Agency, because, as I said a little bit earlier, it's those SASSA grants that can sometimes be used to gamble. Are there mechanisms that could be in place to try and prevent that, to try and ensure that that is no longer the case and that people aren't necessarily using that? Or is it a step too far in determining how people use their money?
Well, I think that would be making a contribution, but it would be a step too far in terms of making sure that you regulate how the people actually spend that particular money. But I guess that is the question that the policymakers will have to respond to say what would be the best way of dealing with that. On our side, we do agree the issue of collaboration is one of the most important aspects in dealing with the issues. That is why we also identify the financial institutions like your Reserve Bank, like your banks, in terms of making sure where people have been gambling illegally or using illegal gambling, then we are able to confiscate those winnings when they actually win, and we get accountability for those ones. And it is important then that we deal with the issue of that, because they would have to forfeit it to the state. And we think that it's one of the deterrents to illegal gambling in the country that we must fight it. But that on its own also requires a partnership. The issue of the social grants and the NSFAS, part of it is us collaborating with them and making sure that we have MOUs in place that are going to make sure that we share information, that are going to make sure that we do joint education programs. This week, we had a team that was in Gqeberha in the Eastern Cape, working with the universities there and some of the stakeholders in that specific area. And yes, there's a great contribution for.
Yeah, it's those kind of efforts and effects that will ultimately be helpful in trying to deter people from doing this that in a way that is harmful, particularly to their livelihoods. Lungile, your job is one of great difficulty, but one imagines that it is ultimately very, very necessary. Lungile Dukwana, the acting CEO of the National Gambling Board, thank you so much for your time.